Okay, perfect. So we are back. Thank you guys for being patient with me and letting me go and do my go to my meetings. That hopefully will be better for you guys. It'll help me be a better teacher. I can be a bit more effective. I can come up with some fun lesson plans for us to share together. So I didn't want to waste this day with you guys just doing lame book work or anything boring like that. So I figured I'd do a little quick screencast and we can just continue discussing some of the things we've been talking about. So here we have a food web, like we've been discussing so far in this unit. I just want to review some of this information, kind of give you guys a few more terms, and then give you guys some examples of some things that maybe you'll find in a testing setting when we talk about these things later on down the road. So, as you guys know and as we've discussed, the ultimate source of all energy that we have on this planet as far as food is concerned starts with the sun, of course, right? And the sun, through its solar power, is able to take the energy that it has, the solar energy, and it is able to transform that, flow that energy down to the plants right here, our producers, who take photosynthesis and they're able to synthesize their own sugar, their own energy, their own food source with the energy from the sun. And that is a huge deal because that is how all of these other animals are going to get their energy and get their food. So the sun transforms its energy to the plant, our producer. Okay, we've talked about this. You guys know this stuff. Okay, then the energy flows even further. Okay, the grasshopper comes around, sees that leaf, wants to munch on it, and so the grasshopper steals the energy from the plant. The plant flows its energy to the grasshopper. Grasshopper gets caught in the web. Spider eats the grasshopper, and then the shrew, or this rat, comes by, eats the spider. The weasel somehow gets its hand on this rat, and then the owl finally is able to eat the weasel, and that is how our food chain ends, at least in this circumstance right here, our food web. Okay. So again, a food web is just a long, a big ecosystem of all these different life forms and how the energy flows from the sun to our producers, to our other consumers, and how they all are kind of linked, okay? So remember, when we had the string, those of us in the classes that we did that, we all had the string linked together in this big web, and once one of us dropped the string, one of the life forms dropped out of that food web, it kind of threw things off balance, right? So all these creatures rely on other creatures in order to survive, to get the energy that they need. So that is how our food web works, and that's how we're able to have our energy get our food that we need. All the energy starts at the sun and transforms, flows down these models till they eventually reach us. Okay, so moving on, a forest. Let's talk about a forest community. A forest community involves many feeding relationships, right? We've talked about that. Like a rainforest, the spider monkeys we talked about with the fruit. The spider monkeys eat the fruit and pass on the seeds, which helps plant the trees. The trees end up feeding a lot of different, not just the spider monkeys, but a lot of different life forms. And so without those spider monkeys, the trees will not have those seeds spread and they can kind of die off like that. So these relationships can be extremely complex to show with a food chain, which is why we integrate them into food webs. We kind of mix them all together. Our food web shows how all that energy flows from the sun to those other organisms. Okay, here's another example of a food web, okay? So looking at this, we have our producers right here, our berries, flowers, our grass, our seeds, which come from grass, or other producers that produce seeds, flowers, fruits, all those things. They produce seeds in order to grow. And these can be eaten by these life forms right here, these other consumers, like the grouse or the chipmunk or the marmot, who eat off of these producers, and therefore the energy is transferred from the producers, ultimately from the sun, which I don't have listed on this slide, but the sun gives its energy to the berries and flowers, to the grass, to the seeds, and they transfer it like that. Eventually the grouse and the chipmunk, the marmot, they all get these things, and then the energy is transferred once more from these consumers right here to these consumers, like the hawk or the bear, okay? And that's how the energy gets shared from the sun. That's how the bear gets its energy, its food. Okay, so we have different classifications. I'm going to move my little face over here to this side so you guys can see it a little more easily. Each of these different life forms has their own classification as well. They all have different names for how they fit into this food web. Okay, so The plants are our producers, okay? We've talked about that. They photosynthesize their own energy from the sun, and so they're able to produce their own energy. And so they are our producers in this food web, okay? They're the producers. Now, the producers have to get consumed by something. They are consumed by our consumers, okay, our grouse or our chipmunk, our marmot. In this case, this butterfly might be eating from the grass, maybe its seeds or its nectar. These all can eat. Our deer, absolutely. A deer is a great example of a consumer that eats off of these producers. Okay, it eats the berries and the flowers, and then eventually it gets consumed by this bear. All right, another consumer that eats off of that. So our plants are producers. They are the first life forms to use the energy directly from the sun. Okay, these guys have to wait in line to get their energy from these other sources, whereas the producers are the first to get their energy from the sun. So they get the most energy from the sun. Okay? The sun gives its energy to the berries and flowers and the insects, and 100% of that solar energy goes straight to our producers. Now, they're not going to pass on that much energy to their counterparts here. Remember, we talked about different kinds of energy and how energy transforms. So it's going to not be as even for them as they pass that on. So they get 100% of the energy from the sun goes to our producers. Okay, they start off with that whole piece. The berries and the flowers, the grasses, the seeds. 100% of the solar power that hits those producers gets turned into energy for them. Okay, not all the energy is used as food for other animals, and that's important. Okay, we talked about how energy doesn't get created or destroyed. It merely gets pushed around or transformed to different life forms. So the sun, all of the sun's energy that goes to those producers is not going on to, say, the consumers, the deer, the grouse, or the marmot, or the chipmunk. Because these producers right here also need some energy to grow and to function and to grow their roots. So it would be silly to think that they're going to give 100% of their energy to the deer. They're going to take some off the top and keep some for themselves in order to grow and function. Okay? The grass is going to do that because it has to grow tall. It has to grow taller and taller to get as much energy from the sun as possible. So all the energy from the sun, yes, they're going to pass on some of it to the other consumers that eat them, but they're going to use quite a bit as well for their own growth. So think of the implications for that when we get further down this food chain. Okay, things are going to get a little crazy, a little hectic for that. So moving on to how are these life forms classified? Let's talk about these consumers right here, okay? Our deer, our grouse, our chipmunk, our marmot, these guys right here. These are all the consumers that eat these producers that are producing this glucose, this sugar from it. So we have a special word to describe these life forms right here that eat our producers, okay? Consumers who eat exclusively producers. These are consumers who eat only plants, like this chipmunk, okay? All he eats is the seed. The grouse, I suppose, eats the insect, so he wouldn't qualify for this. But the deer absolutely would, okay? You guys have probably, let me go ahead and draw a little X over the grouse, so don't consider him when you consider this stuff right here. The consumers who eat exclusively producers are going to have a special word for themselves as well. We're going to call them, let me go back to my, let's see if I can figure out how to, okay, sorry about that, I figured it out. Okay, so, the consumers who eat exclusively producers. This is a word I'm sure you guys have heard before, but what we refer to these life forms as, okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself. So the consumers who eat exclusively producers, they don't get all the plant's energy, right? This deer is not getting all the energy that this plant got from the sun. Okay, the sun's energy gave 100% to this plant, but this plant's not passing on 100% to the deer because it's got to use some of that energy for itself in order to grow and to function. Okay, so their fuel is all the energy the plants, the producers, are not using to live. So this deer right here is going to get a lot of energy from this plant right here. But the energy that it does get, the food that it does get, is all the energy that this flower is willing to give up, that it's not using to grow and to function. So if it got 100% of the sun's energy, this berry plant right here, and it needed, say, 30% of that to grow and function, the deer is only getting 70% of the energy from the sun. This flower right here already used 30% of it in order to sprout its berries or to dig its roots in. So that is what we refer to as herbivores. Like, hey, like that was a weird transition, but the herbivores, our deer and our chipmunk and our marmot, those who eat only plants, exclusive plant eaters. They're the vegans of the animal world, right? You guys know what that phrase means, vegan? That's someone who doesn't eat any animal products. All they eat is fruits and vegetables and grains. So those are our herbivores right here. The deer is a herbivore. Okay, he's not going to be eating any animals at all. He is exclusively eating plants or producers, okay? So that is what we refer to as a herbivore, whereas this hawk is eating these other life forms. He's not only eating plants, he's eating other things as well. Okay, perfect. Herbivores, a bit more on herbivores. Herbivores are consumers, okay, as opposed to producers. Herbivores like the deer and the chipmunk and the marmot are not able to make their own energy from the sun, from carbon dioxide. They rely on eating these other producers, these plants, to get the energy that they need. So they are considered consumers. Since they are the first link in the food or energy chain, okay, as far as animals are concerned, we call them the primary consumers, or the first consumers. So we start with the sun, okay? Technically that's our first link. The sun is our first link. The sun gives its energy to a producer, okay, like this grass right here. The sun's energy goes to a producer. And then the first consumer in that chain after the producer would be our primary consumer. So if we go back a few slides, let's see, perfect, right here, okay? So here's a great example. Our sun is giving its energy to our plant, the producer. Our primary consumer then, it says right here, primary consumer will be this grasshopper. Okay, the grasshopper is a herbivore. It eats exclusively these plants right here. So the sun is our first step. The solar energy from the sun goes to the plant, and then the grasshopper eats the leaves to get its energy that it needs. So the grasshopper is the primary consumer in this case. So you can see as we go further down the chain, we've got other names for these other animals as well, but we'll get to that in just a second. Let's skip back to where we were, right here. Okay. We call them our primary consumers, our first consumers. And they will always have a bigger energy advantage over what eats them. Okay, that might be kind of confusing to you, but think about it like this. So if the plants are getting 100% of the sun's energy, okay, which they are, they have to use, say, 30%, like I said earlier, to grow and to function. And so the deer gets 70% of that, of the sun's energy. Now suppose the deer need 20% for themselves in order to move and to reproduce and to think and to run. The deer need a lot of energy to live as well. And so the bear comes around and eats the deer. Say the deer has already spent 50% of the sun's energy, and therefore is only able to pass on 20% to the bear. So they have an energy advantage over the bear itself. That means that the bear, a lot of that energy from the sun has already been lost by the time it gets to the bear. So he needs to find a different source of energy in order to move and to function. He needs a lot of different sources of energy. That's a better way of putting it. The further down we go up the food chain, the more these animals need to eat in order to maintain the energy. The more energy they need to survive and function, the more food they need, because so much of that energy has already been wasted. So energy, as it moves up the food chain, gets spent. So the deer spent its energy moving and living and was not able to pass that energy on to the bear unless the deer eats more food and gets more energy. And in that case, then it will be spending more energy as well, and the bear won't have as much to eat. Okay. All right, carnivores, okay? We're going to touch on this in the last few seconds that I have. Carnivores are the opposite of herbivores. If herbivores only eat producers or plants, carnivores only eat other consumers. They do not eat plants or producers, okay? So this red-tailed hawk right here is a good example of a carnivore. A lion is a good example of a carnivore. Lions don't eat other plant material. By nature, dogs are carnivores. Okay, your pet dog is a carnivore. It's designed only to eat other animals. Now, we've bred and helped dogs learn how to eat grain and other plants in order to help them survive. Otherwise, a lot of dogs would have died off a long time ago. But by nature, dogs are carnivores. All they want to do is eat other animals. Okay? So on the next video clip, I'll put the link for part 2. We'll talk more about carnivores and other types of animals in nature and how they get their food.